Good morning. We've got a couple unexpected videos today coming from IGN, PSU, and Press Start Australia. The interviews are all surrounding Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. First up, IGN. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII won't feature new story elements, but that doesn't mean it's a basic remaster. Square Enix on how the remaster will perform on the Switch, the controversial new cast, and more. Ever since Final Fantasy VII Remake concluded with its shocking reveal, fans have been speculating on the possibility of a Crisis Core remaster. The moment was certainly ripe for an updated release of the prequel starring Zack Fair, the warrior with a suspicious resemblance to Cloud Strife. Aside from its connection to Final Fantasy VII Remake's story, Crisis Core has been difficult to find in recent years, forcing fans to resort to emulators and other measures. I gotta be honest, I was looking into emulators to try and get a hold of a copy of Crisis Core before the new release this winter, because I wanted a chance to be able to replay the old version before the new version came out. I owned a copy of the PSP version long ago, but I've since gotten rid of the PSP and I no longer have the ability to play the game anymore. Definitely something I think a lot of fans are looking at. That made Square Enix's announcement of Crisis Core Remaster, which coincided with last month's reveal of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. All the more welcome, it's not any mere port either. Square Enix is overhauling the graphics, the interface, and somewhat controversially, the voice cast. Various improvements have been made to nearly all other scenes and battles, to a point where it could be said that the work we are doing is akin to creating a remake. Producer Mariko Sato says, however, as the core elements such as the story are grounded in the original work, we call it a remaster. There's people online that have been referring to this as a remakester, which is kind of a cross between a remaster and a remake. This is very akin to a direct port, a direct copy, with a lot of updates to the content and the gameplay. But it shouldn't deviate so much from the story that they're going to call it a remake outright. A faithful retelling. Speaking with IGN in a brand new interview, Sato discussed Square Enix's intention for the remaster, outlining the differences between the various platforms and whether or not it will ultimately connect with Rebirth. Veteran producer Yoshinori Kitase was also on hand to shed some light on how the project managed to be greenlit in the first place. According to Kitase, Crisis Core was not conceived in response to Final Fantasy VII Remake's infamous reveal. Rather, Kitase says Final Fantasy VII Remake's successful development led Square Enix to realize that other stories from the universe could be updated as well. And I think fans are eagerly awaiting Crisis Core, as well as Ever Crisis, because we want to see what new stories they have to add. But if you're looking at all the games external to Final Fantasy within the Final Fantasy VII compilation, Crisis Core is probably the one that fans are most happy about seeing redone. There isn't really an exact date that I can point to at the moment, but I do recall that it was towards the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake development that we realized with the quality we were able to bring to Final Fantasy VII Remake, we might be able to create something for the stories that are actually surrounding Final Fantasy VII. And it is an actual possibility that we can develop Crisis Core. So that's the timing at which we decided, yes, this remake can happen, Kitase says. Now he says, yes, this remake can happen, but then they ended up calling it a remaster, which I find is interesting. The quality that they brought to Final Fantasy VII is phenomenal. A lot of people are upset about turn-based fighting not being a thing within the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think as time progresses, people change. We are very much more a culture that is short attention span, so I think the faster-paced action battles actually work out a little bit better. There are probably fans that disagree with me, but that's at least how I feel, and I know that I've changed a lot, and I was a huge fan of the turn-based style growing up. That doesn't mean I'm not still interested in something like the real-time strategy with something like Final Fantasy Tactics, but that's just my impressions on Final Fantasy VII and the franchise moving forward. Crisis Core's history stretches back to the days of the PSP, when fans were pining for Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS3. Sony's humble handheld couldn't come close to matching its HD sibling, but Crisis Core still felt like a technical achievement at the time, reimagining the original game's locations in far greater detail than the original PlayStation could imagine. Issues aside, Crisis Core is a great PSP game, no question. It honors Final Fantasy VII's legacy, It has remained popular with the fans in the years since, who laud its excellent finale as being among the best moments in the series. Crisis Core also made Zack, who mainly existed on the periphery of the original game, one of the most popular characters in the series. Until now, though, Crisis Core has been largely locked to the PSP. This is a really great scene that they're talking about, the promise that Cloud makes to Zack. Unfortunately, that video footage is copywritten, so it silences almost all the dialogue if you try to repost it with anything, such as I did at the end of the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth teaser and video overview that I had previously done. As the core elements such as the story are grounded in the original work, we call it a remaster. Yeah, that's exactly what he had said earlier, is they wanted to do a remaster, but then he had gone ahead and said, we are going to make a remake, which half true. Either way, this is what we're getting, so it sounds good either way. When Reunion was finally announced last month, fan reaction was largely positive, with plenty noting that what seemed like significantly enhanced visuals, but there were also questions. Just how deep would this remaster or remake go? And what about the voice cast led by Rick Gomez, who did so much to bring Zack to life in the first place? On the first point, it's apparent that Crisis Core will be a substantial update indeed. In addition to overhauled graphics, Crisis Core will be fully voiced, while also featuring a newly arranged soundtrack. The gameplay is also getting an update, with Zack's attack combos now being linkable and limit breaks being accessible at any time, which is fantastic. Not just when they pop up in the game slot machine, known as the Digital Mindwave System, or DMW. The DMW, for its part, will remain largely the same, meaning the elements such as leveling will remain random as ever. Yeah, I mean, there were issues with that when I was playing the game, but it wasn't so noticeable, being that everything was on the slot machine previously. Having access to limit breaks will probably still make it a far better system than Final Fantasy IX's trance system, so I can't complain at all, and I'm definitely looking forward to it. In the meantime, all the original assets are being replaced with the updated versions utilizing Unreal Engine 4, the intention being to be visually aligned and up to the standards of Final Fantasy VII Remake. According to Sato, to that end, the PC version will target an impressive 120 FPS, while the PS5 and Xbox Series XS versions will be 60 FPS. Sato didn't elaborate on the Switch version, but did say that there would be differences in the resolution and FPS. 60 FPS is fine for a lot of people. Honestly, I don't think a lot of players will notice a difference between 60 and 120. The big reason for wanting the PC port, in my opinion, is the modability of the game at that point, and what you can do with the models. And even playing through at 60 FPS is more than sufficient, and it will be a godsend to just see this game ported over from a handheld device. Our main purpose with this title is that we wanted a really wide range of players to be able to play on whatever platform they desired, Kitase says. So we're looking forward to seeing which platforms that players go for, because the gaming experience will be solid and the same great experience on all platforms. This is a really interesting point. Being able to release Crisis Core on all platforms available at the same time will give them a better understanding of how to use, which platforms they want to release on in the future. It's true that Final Fantasy VII is exclusive to PlayStation, to Sony, but having the opportunity to kind of ship this wherever is going to give them a better idea of which market is performing the best with this game in mind. Square Enix's attempt to align with Final Fantasy VII Remake is impacting not just the visual, but the voice acting as well. To the consternation of some of the more dedicated fans of the series, in the wake of the announcement, many of the most upvoted comments lamented the loss of Gomez and other members of the original team. Kitase describes the decision in terms of renewal. Since Final Fantasy VII was a title that had been beloved for 20 years, we wanted to ensure that with this renewed project, the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, that it would be loved for another 20 years to come, and so that's when we invited a whole new cast of voice actors into the title. Kitase explains, I enjoyed the voice acting from the game. It wasn't so great that I, couldn't see it being replaced. I think, there's plenty of people out there that never got a chance to experience Crisis Core, so although it is a very highly anticipated fan base remaster, because of what the original game was, I think anything that they do will be seen as a benefit to the future of Final Fantasy VII and the compilation. Gomez was replaced by Caleb Prince back in Final Fantasy VII Remake, so the change is expected. Nevertheless, at least some fans miss Gomez, with one going so far as to edit the original voice actor into Final Fantasy VII Remake. Take heart though, Crisis Core Reunion will also feature the return of Brianna White, who has so wonderfully brought Aerith to life in Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is really good news. You're kind of taking a step forward in the compilation as it is. So you have Final Fantasy VII and all the OG games kind of in the back, right? And then you're moving forward. And if they can maintain continuity with all the new titles, remasters, remakes, releases, that's going to make everything feel a lot more synchronized, a lot more immersive. So I have nothing but positive things to say about that. In other areas, meanwhile, Crisis Core Reunion will remain faithful to the original game. According to Sato and Katase, fans shouldn't expect new story content in the update, which explains why Square Enix is referring to it as a remaster, despite the substantial improvements being made across the board. And this was something that I think a lot of people were expecting with Final Fantasy VII. They wanted a standard turn-based, complete revamp of the original game. And so the retelling, the variations in retelling were somewhat controversial. I still think it was a great title, the remake, and I think being able to see the old story through new visual, graphic, the action-based combat, etc., is only helping advance, the fact that this game is standing the test of time. It was good back then. It's better now, arguably, because now you have a chance to grow with the game that you loved before. Instead of kind of staying in the past. With Final Fantasy VII Remake, it was a new starting point for Final Fantasy VII, and so we decided to expand the story. But with the Crisis Core Reunion, it is a remaster, and it's still positioned as a story that expands on the original Final Fantasy VII story. And so we didn't want to stray too far from that. It absolutely makes sense. Sato adds that there are no plans to include new elements in the story, meaning new side quests and other storylines are most likely out of the window. But that doesn't necessarily preclude, say, a post-credits teaser that sets the stage for Rebirth. That is an interesting concept, and it says a lot about what their plans are for reintroducing Zack into the franchise as far as Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth, etc. Because he was obviously teased in the remake, he was teased in the Rebirth trailer. So to see what they do to incorporate him, I think a lot of fans are speculating and anticipating those changes. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII Reborn. When Crisis Core Reunion is released later this year, it will in some ways be the culmination of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII project that began way back in the early 2000s. Like the PSP game before it, it will be intimately connected to the main game, providing crucial context while telling an entertaining story of its own. Square Enix's recent history with remakes and remasters has been checkered, to put it kindly, with the classics like Secret of Mana marred by poor graphics and strange design choices. Katase and Sato don't acknowledge any particular lessons learned from earlier projects, but do say that Square Enix has been listening to feedback from fans that much is evident from the work being put out into Crisis Core Reunion, which is shaping up to be a major improvement on the slapdash ports of the past, and including the slapdash ports of the past. That includes Chrono Cross, which was a recent port done by Square Enix, and that one was divisive in its reception as well. So hopefully, this is a fantastic graphical update, but it also feels very much like the original game and the way the story was being told. More importantly, it reflects a degree of faith in the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. Whatever happens, it seems as if Square Enix wants to make sure this is done right. I've been watching a lot of reaction videos of people just reacting to the announcements, and it really gives me the sense that a lot of people are out there waiting for these games and seeing their reaction, in a sense, very satisfying. Katase says, "Yes, we were able to provide these things to fans, so it's been great." Yeah, I was out there watching the 10, actually 14-minute announcement as well, and it was just hit after hit after hit coming from the Final Fantasy VII 25th anniversary team. And, Katase is spot on. Being able to provide these things so far has been great. And I hope it only gets better with time. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion does not yet have a release date, but Square Enix is aiming for winter 2022, which could be any time up until March of 23. Basically that window of December to March. December 22 to March 23. Our next interview from Press Start, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion interview. The lead developer on updating a handheld classic for multiple platforms. Alright. The announcement of a very thorough remastering of Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII set in the fandom into a frenzy last month, and for good reason. The original is widely regarded as one of the best Final Fantasy spin-off titles, and gave specifically Final Fantasy VII fans a huge amount of insight into the history of most iconic characters. The remaster, titled Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, also looked absolutely gorgeous in its first showing, bringing the aging PSP version kicking and screaming into the modern era and looking incredibly close to what we saw in 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game looks amazing. I can't wait. Let's see how deep this goes. Crisis Core Reunion promises a near-total overhaul of the handheld version's visuals and gameplay mechanics, making it scarily close to a remake over a remaster. Or does it? We're still debating that stuff. And like I said, there's people out there referring to it as a remakester, which is as accurate as you can get without saying the storyline is changing. With improved character and camera controls, updated UI, new battle mechanics, full voice acting, and new musical arrangements, a ton of work has gone into this, and I was lucky enough to jump on a call with some legendary names in Final Fantasy development to pick their brains about how it all came about. My time with Mariko Sato, producer, Tetsuya Nomura, creative director, and Yoshinori Kitase, executive producer, was certainly brief, and all three remained predictably tight-lipped on specifics. But chatting with these greats is always an honor, so check out what they had to say. Why did you decide to revisit Crisis Core at this time? Tetsuya Nomura, remastering Crisis Core has always been kind of something that we've been wanting to do and have been talking about. But with the Final Fantasy VII Remake project and putting all that together schedule-wise and just project direction-wise, there were a lot of unknowns. So now that Final Fantasy VII Remake has been released and we kind of know where everything is headed, we felt like this is a good time to announce Crisis Core Reunion. Absolutely. And I think with the previous interview, if they're talking about teasing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at the very end of it, this is a good time to implement it because you're going to get that period of time in between releases. So this one comes out this year, the next one will come out next winter. You have a little bit of time to build up anticipation through a sort of gaming marketing campaign. You put out the game, you tell a little history, you put out a teaser, and then they're more excited for the game that's coming out the following year. Why opt for a remaster for this game rather than remake in style of Final Fantasy VII? Yoshinori Kitase. So with the Final Fantasy VII remakes, we're creating the Final Fantasy VII story and experience from scratch, and it's a really huge undertaking that's also very time-consuming. And with the kind of roadmap that we are envisioning for the three titles that are to be included in the Final Fantasy VII Remake series, we felt that, to keep those main three titles coming out at a good pace and not overextend the whole project and keep players waiting, remastering Crisis Core was the best way to go about it. That way we can ensure the Final Fantasy VII remakes would be available to players in a timely fashion, but also we'll be able to provide Crisis Core Remaster in the time between Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And with the remake and Zack, I think that if you've played that, you know that Zack has become more of a prevalent character. There's more focus on him, so to be able to bring Crisis Core into the mix was something that we really wanted to do. You notice these interviews start having a lot of the same beats based on the questions. Everyone's interested in the same things, but there are little nuggets that they're pulling out that are value added to, kind of bouncing around each of these interviews and getting all the information. The way we ensure Final Fantasy VII remakes would be available to players in a timely fashion was to be able to release Crisis Core Remaster in the time between. That's what I was talking about. You release Final Fantasy VII Remake, there's a little bit of development time, then you release Crisis Core Reunion. Then you have, on the tail end of that, another game in the series. You're not making fans wait for something, you're giving them something to wet their whistle. And then you have another game that was just teased after the previous one. And that's phenomenal because fans want the content. They want to speculate. They want the hype. So being able to get that up front and be able to play this game, which again is another fan favorite, before Rebirth is really just a pleasure to be living in this time of Square Enix's second coming, if you will. The reveal trailer showed that Zack's Buster Sword now matches the remake version. Can we expect many other tweaks or major additions to the Crisis Core's narrative in the remaster? Marika Sato. In regards to new things in Crisis Core Reunion story-wise, we're really doing a faithful retelling of the original Crisis Core, so there are no new story elements, but there are, on the other hand, many adjustments and improvements that we made to the gameplay experiences as a whole. One of the big things was battles. We wanted to make sure that players coming from the Final Fantasy VII Remake experience would be able to kind of just jump into Crisis Core and have a smooth experience. So there's some adjustments we're making, and also it's been going to be fully voiced this time. The music tracks are all rearranged, and there's so many small and big improvements that we've been making. Too many to list here, but I really hope that players will be able to enjoy the Crisis Core experience. What considerations did you need to make when porting a handheld game to platforms designed for a big screen? Marika Sato. With bringing the previously portable title to the big screen, the team carefully considered the visuals and graphics as a whole, because that's one of the main things you'll be noticing when the game is now on a big screen. So we tried to align the visuals and graphics as much as we could with Final Fantasy VII Remake, but also it's not just a simple transition from a small to big screen, it's also about how do we update the game so that it's something that current modern day players will be able to really enjoy, because there's so many action games and action battles that players of today have experienced, and that's kind of different from what the original battle systems was like. So we wanted to really bring a modern feel to the battles as a whole, and we feel we've been able to do a good job with that. So I hope players will look forward to it. Yeah, anything they can do to update the wave system will be fantastic. And like they said, they had already updated it moderately to allow you to use limit breaks at any given time that they're available, instead of reducing your opportunities to when they pop up in the slot machine. It is a big transition from a small screen to a big screen, and it is a good thing that they're going to remain faithful to Final Fantasy VII Remake's style for fighting, because I think that's going to be beneficial to keeping players engaged and giving them that similar experience. Would you recommend this game to players who have played Final Fantasy VII Remake but aren't familiar with the full Final Fantasy story yet? Before reading this, yes, they're definitely going to recommend it to players. They're not going to release a game that that has part of the story, and it's a prequel. They're not going to be like, hey, you played the game, now play this other game so you get more information. Like, they're not going to say, no, don't do that, don't play our game. We're releasing it for people to shelf. We just want to see how much dust they can collect. And any further questions? Tetsuya Nomura. Crisis Core is a contained story in and of itself, so it can definitely is enjoyable as a standalone game. But if players of Final Fantasy VII Remake or Final Fantasy VII really want to get to know these characters like Zack on a deeper level, I think that Crisis Core Reunion is going to be an important piece of that. Even just getting a wider, more in-depth and richer understanding of different characters like Sephiroth and what kind of person he was before you get to meet him in Final Fantasy VII. Things like what kind of casual daily conversations did Sephiroth have, and pieces of the story the characters are going to enhance the experience of playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is coming after this. Crisis Core Reunion is definitely an integral piece of that, just getting to really know the Final Fantasy VII lore and world. He was very careful not to mention anything about Angeal or Genesis, and so I find it interesting. He was very focused on Zack and Sephiroth, and it's true, they both are in Crisis Core, they are both in Remake Rebirth in some way. How much of that is going to translate into the new game if Zack is still alive somehow, or if there's some way we're going to play as him, or it's just going to be based on memories. Either way, it's interesting conceptually, but I think diving back deeper into his comments, he was extremely focused on talking about Sephiroth and what he contributed to Crisis Core. There's a lot of other characters that are there that are, I think, deeper than Sephiroth is, and not necessarily Zack, because he was the protagonist of the story, but I believe that there's things that you're going to see in that story of the game that that's going to move forward into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as well. Fans online have already expressed that they want all the sillier moments in the original Crisis Core to remain, such as the Sephiroth fan club emails. Has anything been cut from the game? Marika Sato. Yes, definitely we didn't cut that part out. It's going to be included just like it was in the original. Fantastic. Sephiroth Fantastic. Is there anything that you've been able to realize in Crisis Core on modern platforms that simply wasn't possible on the PSP? With the original Crisis Core, thinking of the pacing of the battles, it was closer to a command-based action system, and then with the Final Fantasy VII Remake being more fast-paced and closer to an actual action battle, we wanted to kind of bring the Crisis Core battle system closer to that fast-paced feeling, but still maintain the kinds of systems from the original game as well. Most of the improvements and things related to the battle system were in the care of Sato-san, but the one thing that I actually wanted to specifically implement was the camera controls, because with the PSP there was only a joystick on the left side, and that was what was used to control the camera. But with modern day devices, there's a joystick on both sides, and it might feel more natural to control the camera with the right side. So I really feel like, for players today who are used to that kind of control, the PSP version's camera control might feel a little bit stressful. So that was one change I really wanted to have improved. So looking at, your typical, controller, you have a joystick on both sides. On the PSP, camera control was only being done by this left trigger, while now they're going to shift it back over to the right side, so that as you're moving around, you can just do those slight modifications with your right thumb. And I think that they're absolutely right. This is a big improvement to just playing in general. There were definitely some elements in the PSP version of Crisis Core that must have been a challenge to update now that players have full control of the camera. What work needed to be done there? So yeah, just as you say, with the camera controls, since it was quite limited in the original PSP version, there were certain parts of the environment that hadn't really been fleshed out. So with this remastering and with the freedom that players have with camera controls, there were certain areas that we actually had to build anew or just really upgrade the quality. So that was one of the challenges that we did face in this remaster. I think with that question, we're going to end up redoing all those environments anyway. So it was probably easier for them. And I don't know what the original development software was for Crisis Core, but I guarantee you it was different. And while they may have assets and ideas, building a full environment probably felt better to them anyway, just to make it feel like the player was actually immersed in the location that they were playing through, and that you wouldn't have like these long hallways where you could only see, the front and the back, or very limited peripherals. Will there be any major differences between the game running on all the platforms it's launching on? So we had this one previously. FPS is going to be different, but the content should be the same. Switch is probably going to be the one that's the biggest concern for most people. But they haven't really said anything specifically on why it's going to be different yet. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of Final Fantasy VII. Why do you think this particular entry in the series has endured so long? I think that, one of the main things that fans continue to gravitate towards is the characters and the unique individual personalities that exist in the Final Fantasy VII story. And each character has their own story and drama that comes with them. And it's almost like the story really revolves around these characters. And with Crisis Core, the main objective is to add further depth to the characters and really flesh out the storyline and the characters. And so every title that's attached to Final Fantasy VII is about the characters, and I think that's why it continues to be loved for so long. Zack is a pretty substantial character in the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy VII series. His role in Final Fantasy VII is significant in defining who Cloud is. So the fact that you get to play through a game as Zack Fair and experience all the things that led up to Cloud being who he is, or who he thinks he is in the beginning of Final Fantasy VII, really hits home for a lot of fans. I had a thought earlier and I lost it, but it's back now. Releasing Crisis Core in between Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is that thing that's going to carry them to the next game. Now think about that gap between Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy VII, whatever the final third title is going to be. And I think Dirge's Cerberus remake or remaster is probably a good candidate for that time frame, due to the introduction of Vincent in Final Fantasy VII Part 2. Maybe they do something different, but that's what I think is going to happen going forward. All right, we've got our final interview now with PSU. Interview with Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, producer Mariko Saito, executive producer Yoshinori Kitase, and creative director Tetsuya Nomura. Number 3. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion's announcement in the middle of June was more than just well received by fans, as it's kind of a remaster series lovers have wanted for years. And as we talked about this earlier, this is akin to what people were expecting for Final Fantasy VII with the previous name title. In all the excitement, I got a chance to ask producer Mariko Saito, executive producer Yoshinori Kitase, and creative director and character designer Tetsuya Nomura questions for PSU. Thank you to the wonderful folks at Square Enix for giving us the opportunity to sit down and chat with these incredible people who are currently working on the Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion Remaster. What was the inspiration to go back and remaster Crisis Core? I know that Zack seems to have a bigger impact in the remake than the original 7. Nomura, with regards to Final Fantasy VII Remake, people who played it know that Zack has a bigger role in the remake than the original, and so if players play Crisis Core Reunion, then as Crisis Core is positioned as a prequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake story. What? With regards to Final Fantasy VII Remake, people who played it know that Zack has a bigger role in the remake than the original, and so if players play Crisis Core Reunion, then as Crisis Core is positioned as a prequel to the Final Fantasy VII Remake story. I'm not sure I understand what is being said there, but we'll just skip through. As you might have seen in the preview of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Zack is going to be a larger part of the story than the original, and so it would be great for people to go out and play Crisis Core Reunion to get a full understanding of the character and the whole storyline. There's our boy Zack. With the assets such as cutscenes to be remade for the new remaster, or have they been upscaled and improved from the original PSP version? Saito, so all the assets were recreated from scratch. The motions, though, we wanted to make faithful to the original, so those have been kind of used for Crisis Core Reunion. And there were some event scenes that have been improved from the original. The assets have been made from scratch, but there are improvements here and there that we have made to other aspects of the game. The soundtrack has been remastered for this version of the game. There will be an option for the original version, or is it just remastered music? There's going to be an option to go from remastered music versus the original soundtrack, but the reason we are doing, because the tracks are being remastered by the original composer, Ishimoto, and so they have been remastered. That is very faithful to the original work. If you listen to the music in the trailer, it is already some of the music that has been remastered already. Fans who have seen the trailer will kind of feel nostalgia that it hasn't changed much or shocked them. The soundtrack should be very close to the original. So I'm not going to lie to you, this interview seems very poorly edited. So I'm not going to take too much time with it. If I see something that jumps out to me as key information or information that you should know or be aware of, I'll stop and kind of go over it a little bit more. Otherwise, I'm just going to read through it. But let's keep going. TLDR so far is they're making updates to the game, and music will be remastered, and they won't have an option to go and use the original music. There were rumors for the longest time that the reason we never saw a remaster or a port of Crisis Core on console is because the licensing deal with GACT. Was there any substance behind this rumor, or was it more of a timing thing due to other projects? To answer the first part of your question, the rumors aren't true. There was nothing to do with GACT or a contract that was preventing a remastered version of Crisis Core. As you said, this was more due to timing. There were talks of making Crisis Core Remaster earlier, but we were in the middle of developing Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you play it, there were quite a lot of things added from the original Final Fantasy VII. So we felt it was appropriate to wait until the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake before working on Crisis Core Reunion. On your second question, whether there were any new lines recorded with GACT, Crisis Core is fully voiced but no new lines recorded by GACT. All the lines needed from him were recorded with the original Crisis Core, and nothing new was added this time. Yeah, so it sounds like they had all the lines. It really came down to timing. And as a fan, I would rather have the core game, Final Fantasy VII, as the priority, and this one take a back seat. But obviously, like many others, I'm still looking forward to playing it. Will Crisis Core be the same engine that ran Final Fantasy VII Remake? Saito. So engine-wise, we are using Epic Unreal Engine 4 for showing the assets and things like that, but the basic programming is being covered from the original game. I know this is probably way too early to ask, but do you have any plans for a collector's edition of the game? We don't have any definitive reply for this, but we want to try and do as many things as possible to make fans happy. But if we can do a collector's edition, we'll try to announce so everyone is aware. Thank you so much for your time. I want to use my last few minutes to thank everyone on the team and tell them I look forward to finding out more information on Crisis Core Reunion as we get closer to release later on in the year and getting my hands on it. All right. So later this year, PS5 and PS4. So they did have a generic release date for this. It didn't say the wrong release date, which is obviously a pro to the PSU team. They just need to work on their editing a bit. But that's it for updates in regards to Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion. That's a wrap on the interviews for Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. As always, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.